Alright, today we're going to do something real different. I really tried to do a good job on this. I hope it works for you. But I came up with a test to try to compare the value of different level 10s in a random context. And this is going to be kind of confusing to explain, and I'm going to try to do so efficiently and not take so long it gets boring and technical. The outputs of this are going to be in some places quite weird. I think there's a lot that's really interesting if you are sort of interested in not esoteric, but kind of here is potentially fascinating mathematical insights into part of the game you probably haven't thought about and possibly don't care that much about, then this is the video for you. So the basic idea is I took a bunch of games. This is one example where I put in a starter and I give one hand all 5 cards and a locked starter, and the other hand is 4 cards. And I rotate in every possible card that could be the fifth card. So, like A964, A963, A962, A954, A953. I rotate every possible level 10 configuration through, including if there's multiple versions of a card. For instance, A964 is what I will describe as a wheel. You can go around it in a circle from the lowest to the highest number or the highest to the lowest. A946 I am treating as a different card. I call that a spear card, where the highest number, the A, is surrounded by the next two highest numbers, the 9 and the 6. And a horizontal or vertical card, I'm just going to call them verts this video, A694, where the highest numbers are opposite each other and the lowest numbers are also opposite each other. Now you might say there's A964, but there's also 964A, etc., etc. For this, I normalized all cards to have their highest number up and their second highest number right, and their third highest number for the wheel down, for the spear to the left, etc. So there are 3 versions of A964 being tested, and each card is facing the action. I did other tests with starters in different positions so as to get like averaging what plays well playing opposite the card played, what plays well playing sort of next to or adjacent, and other parts of the board. But the basic idea is to test, and I tested like 127 different card configurations, which numbers are best. And I did this example, and I did a bunch of other examples, and I averaged them all together to get their scores. I also looked at scores. I did a test of this. Here is a test for value on second turn. I did tests on first turn. I did a bunch of comparisons, and we're going to look at the outputs. But the basic idea is if this card is added randomly to a hand, how many ties do you have out of the 40 moves available? And I saw real difference in results. There were cards that you can put in here that are level 10 cards. Again, it's facing the action where there will be 10 to 15 ties. And there are other cards you can insert here where you will have 30 to 35 moves that tie out of 40. So you can get 6 to 7 out of every 8 moves tie, and you can get down to 2 or 3 out of every 8 moves tie. This is a huge difference. I will not be able to separate between what's an easier or harder to find tie. I'm just finding total number. But if the total number is that different, that's pretty telling. And I'm averaging a bunch of examples of this, and we're getting a ranking of what maybe are the best cards. Now, this gives more detail if you want to pause and read. A bunch of this I've already said. From now on, when I describe a card as better or worse in the video, it means the output of this test was better. And this is an objective count, right? This is just saying how many moves tie or how many moves lose, and I am just having the solver tell me that number. There is a bunch of things put in that are not purely objective, right? The hands I happen to use as examples, the starter positions. I have not yet put in enough examples that I think this averages out. So there easily could have been biases introduced that way. But in general, given the stuff I put in, this is just counting how many ties or losses or wins are available in each spot and scoring accordingly. There is very little, if any, of my opinion put in. The hands I constructed for this may have some biases, but there's not opinion. These are not my opinions. These are what the solver outputs given these inputs. And if I put in the same inputs, I would get the same outputs every time. That doesn't mean the scores it outputs are correct. I think there's lots of reasons they could not be. I do not agree with them in all cases, though I think in some I don't agree, but it's pointing to something really interesting. So let's look at some results, and I divided it up a few different ways. One is I looked for cards that scored really well or much better on second turn than on first turn. So this doesn't mean the cards here are all great or all good. This is just cards that scored way better on second turn than first turn. Because I thought it would be interesting to look at this and try to identify what is valuable in helping second turn. And the things I notice when looking at this are one, AA rares score really well. Two, 8 8s and 9 9s tend to be really second turn heavy hitters. But this is not always true. For instance, in these tests, and this is kind of shocking, the single type of card that scored best on second turn was Luca, the A478. And in that wheel configuration, Balthier, the spear version, also scored well, but in the tests I've done so far, Luca has been the absolute, or any card with that configuration, has been the absolute best scoring second turn card. Now, it's not by a big margin, there's a lot of cards that are close, that just happens to be in first right now, but it's still pretty impressive for that card. So, one thing I think is interesting to do is if you look at the cards I show and try to see if there are patterns, maybe you can realize something I haven't. I think there's a lot to explore here. Now, notably, I think rares, AA rares, corner rares, are very good on first turn, but this suggests they are very good as starters. This is ranking cards as after the starter, do you want these to be in your hand? And these are cards that do really well or much better in your hand if you are on second turn than if you are on first turn. Note, like 7984 is a bad card. It's not that it performs well on second turn, it just performs a lot better on second turn than on first. It's like bad on first, or bad on second, but terrible on first. Some of these cards are great on second, like A478, a lot of the A88s, the rares are great on second turn, and maybe okay on first turn, right? But these are just looking for cards that are way better second than first. Here's cards that are way better on first than second. One thing I notice here is a lot of the A9s play a lot better on first turn. The horizontal vertical rare AAs, like Rhinoa or Tella or Fussy, are terrible on second turn. If it was just second turn, they would be the worst ranked cards. On first turn, they rank pretty good. So they ended up not ending up as the lowest rated cards. I see a lot of A9s here. I do see some 8s, but where we saw 8s before, we saw 8s with A's a lot of the time, or 9s. Here, we see 8s with 6s and 7s. And that seems to play a lot better on first turn. So, a bunch of potentially interesting things to note. A lot more A7s and A6 type cards, more A9s, while the other one was a lot more A8s. That's one thing I notice. Yeah, I think that's all I notice here. But again, you might spot things I didn't. And these are all cards that had a significant gap in performance, and these were ones that clearly favored first turn, and the other was ones that clearly favored second turn. Cards that I didn't list in either category are cards that were pretty neutral. And any rotated version of a card counts as the same. So for instance, I put Sturm, the 2-9A6, you can see towards the top right. If you're like, well, you didn't list Garnet, A926, that's just the same thing but rotated or spun around. It's the same card, just in a different configuration. And that would be Garnet would also be here. I only put one instance of each type of card here. You might say I put multiple instances like Waka 6688 as well as the 6868, but no, those are different cards, right? One of those is the vertical, one of those is the corner version. So you could take screenshots of this and the previous and compare, and you might figure out something about differences between what plays well on first and second turn. And if anyone has ideas, I would be fascinated because I think this is such an interesting topic. These are cards that if you put the opposite of the card on the board, this card gains most in value. Almost anything is happy to see its opposite, but these were cards that got more benefit than usual. And there are certain cards that saw very little benefit and fell in the rankings, and we'll look at those next. So I think of this category as if you can build synergies, these are cards that have a lot more value than normal. And the next category is these are cards that will always have value no matter what they're paired with, but or always have their value, right? They might start low value and maintain low value. But the next category will, yeah, so this category is cards that benefit from synergy. And the next category is cards that don't benefit much from synergy, but that is to say, they have their value sort of whether or not you build synergies for them. They don't need as much work to help, but they also don't benefit as much from help. So I didn't show all the cards here, but it was just a lot of stuff with A's, like a lot of A8s and A7s. Basically, nothing without an A rose in the ranks with its pair, which makes a lot of sense because same wall is a very powerful effect, and so cards with A's just benefit more from pairs than other cards. It's not that they can't, you could see 9/8s having synergy and 8/6s and stuff like that, but the A synergy is just more powerful. A693 and A694 type stuff. So that's the vert versions. Uh, really jumped when paired. They were some of the biggest jumpers. Now they tend not to rank that high at the start because horizontal verticals tend not to rate very high. We'll talk more about that later. But they were a type of card that benefits a lot from synergy. They are usually the clear worst version of a card, but you can get them a lot closer if synergistic. Um, and generally, like A9/6s did really well paired. And so, like Squall Cipher, this says, yeah, that's a very good pairing. It also liked the new Joker Akechi pairing. There is no pairing for vert rares, for vert AAs, like Rhinoa or Takesis. But it thought if because I put cards in that didn't exist in these tests, if you could pair those, it got pretty excited about that, which made me think that a Rhinoa Takesis hand could be kind of interesting, because that's the closest we have to having that kind of pairing. And yeah, all the A9/6 stuff really benefited from synergy. On the other hand, cards that did not benefit from pairs, that did not do particularly better seeing its partner on the board, were A8s of all stripes. A88s, A865s, A856s, A872s, A855s. I put some images here of examples, but basically the whole cluster of A8s does not care that much about having its partner. And I think this is fascinating and fits some of my understandings, but not others, but maybe adds to them. Because I've done a bunch of testing and hand thinking, some with the solver, but a lot more on my own, where I have concluded that hands filled with A8s often struggle. And I've concluded that A8s are not that good. And this says no, no, no. A8s are good, but you don't want to mass them because they're all good cards, but they don't get better as you're adding a ton of them in the way that other cards really pay off. So having one or two, really nice value in a hand. Having all four or five, you're not getting additional value off the synergies. And that's really interesting to me. I think that's fascinating. 8866 is also in this category. In general, just cards with a lot of eights are not that benefited by synergy. But if they were good cards, that means they will be good whether or not you work hard to add cards they work well with. The most interesting card here is probably the Celesteria combo, which I've always liked, but never scored that well with. So perhaps this is something fitting there. The only cards without an 8 that showed up as actively unsynergistic were 9974 and 9955. 9955 makes a ton of sense to me because the numbers they're going to hit for sames just aren't very common, and they can't take each other, and they can't same wall or plus wall each other. 9974 is a little more play with itself, but in general, you can see a lot of 9/9s don't do well with pairs. It's not that they're bad cards, it's that they don't do well with pairs. I will note 9/9/8s did really well on second turn. They were in the second turn graphic, but I should note they were real all stars on second turn only. All right, next up, we can talk about horizontals and verticals. In general, verts are the weakest of the three configurations, wheel, spear, and vert. They are the weakest usually by a large margin, but they benefit from a bunch of things, and even though they're probably still, in general, the weakest card, if you put in some work, they are not the weakest by that much. Times when they're better. 1. They tend to benefit a little more from synergy than other cards, especially if they have an A on them. 2. If they are angled towards a side starter, they do quite well. So, for instance, the 7-8-5-8 you can see an image of, if there is a starter in 2 or 6, that kind of forces the game into this side to side plane, and it can be a really good sweeper on that side to side plane and can play really well. And especially cards with double numbers like 7-8-5-8 or like 6-9-4-9, and cards with an A always get some benefits, so like A6-9-4 type stuff. These cards, if you make the game side to side, will suddenly start playing really well and can equal or even exceed the value of corner cards. Um, they also become terrible, however. Like a 7-8-5-8 is terrible with a 2 starter. It really doesn't want the game, or an 8 starter especially, does not want the game to be up down, needs it to be side to side. One other really interesting feature was they jump a lot in value after center starters, but they are really poor at defending against center starters. So if you have a lot of horizontal verticals, maybe it's worth considering a starter in 5. They often play well. But if you have a lot of horizontal verticals and your opponent plays in 5, that can be very annoying for you. And this actually checks out with 2 instances I want to mention. When Addy destroyed me in Clan League, I had a hand with a lot of horizontal verticals that I like using, and he did a starter in 5, and suddenly I couldn't get them to click, and I collapsed and lost badly. And one other instance I'm reminded of is Triad Wars 14 quarterfinals against Tezuka was a game where I saw Turds play a hand that I hadn't considered his card choices at all. He used some horizontal vertical types that I had completely undervalued and wouldn't have considered, but it looked so strong in his hands, I decided to try them. And thinking about the hand, I realized I think these play really well after a center starter. And you can go look up that game, Triad Wars 14 quarterfinals, if you want to see that in practice. But this is something I'd never thought about, though I had figured out something related to it, but I'd never thought about it explicitly. But it's an interesting thought about when 5 starters might be good for you or bad for your opponent. Something I've not thought about, and this is really interesting stuff that potentially brings us in directions we haven't gone in. That doesn't mean it's all correct, but I think it's fascinating to think about. Wheel cards. One huge difference between wheels and spears is I started doing second turn testing first, and just across the board I was seeing wheels are better than spears. And then I switched to first turn testing, and across the board I saw spears are better than wheels. And I just thought this was so interesting. I generally have a slight preference for spears, but like wheels in particular number configurations, but had never thought about it as a first or second turn difference. And this really strongly suggested that spears are good on first turn and wheels are good on second turn. And this is true for just almost any type of card you can think of. It's just so interesting. Um, in general, looking at these are cards where overall the wheels are clearly outperforming the spears. Maybe the spear is better on first turn, but in general, these are cards where the wheel card is usually preferable to the spear version. A8-6-5s, A7-6-5s, A8-7-3s, A9-6-3s, A9-5-4s, and A9-7-1s. And as best I can tell, the consistent pattern on these is they tend to be cards with more one gaps. That cards with one gaps like the wheel type. And if we think about other cards that are really good as wheels, 8-7-6-5s, 8-7-6-4s, these are cards with one gaps as well. 7-6-3-2s, most people like the 7-6-3-2 more than the 7-6-2-3, which I would note is also a card with a lot of one gaps on it, meaning numbers one apart. and a card that people tend to prefer the wheel version. So I think the evidence here, and again, this isn't a big sample, I'm not super confident, but my thought is cards with one gaps, though A963 doesn't really fit that except for the A9 part, or it is A971, but my thought is the more one gaps are on a card, the more you might expect the wheel version to outperform the spear version. Now let's look at some cards where the spear version was better. A981 has a lot of one gaps. And again, even if a card didn't exist, I tested it. So I tested Larsa, but I also tested A981 and I tested A891 and compared them. So we do have the different versions of that. And that has one gaps, and that is actually better in the Larsa configuration. But the other cards are not so much. And I noticed that the cards that tended to be really good here are cards with A's, 9s, and 6s tended to do best with spears, which tells us maybe something about level 10, but is hard to generalize to other levels. But we might say it's cards with big corners where the other numbers tend not to be one gaps, right? A954, we saw that in the other category, better as a wheel. A962 or A964, we see here better as a spear, which was against my instinct. I expected Squall Cipher to outperform. So maybe this suggests something like an 8743 is better as a wheel, but an 8752 might be better as a spear. Maybe that's the generalizable version. This will take a lot of testing, and I'm not going to get to it for a while, but again, I think this is so interesting. And finally, here were the top 10 rated types of cards. In 10th, we have A757 was its favorite version of the 7/7s. The A7/7s in general, it liked. Doesn't like A7/3/7s so much, but no one really likes those cards. A7/4/7s and A7/5/7 stuff it liked. This was its favorite version, was the spear version. A8/2/8s, it generally really likes A8/8s. Again, it doesn't think you need a lot of them. And A8/2/8 was its favorite version, beating out like Sephiroth. 8866s, it really likes, just thinks they're very good. Weirdly, it loves the A953 wheel. That kept scoring really high. You'll notice A964s are not here, but A953s and A963s are. Now, A964s did score well. They weren't in the top 10, but do a few more tests, maybe they'll move up into it. But for now, it really liked A953s and A963s. Not entirely sure why that is. I think I might have done some testing that weirdly biased towards having a 3 on it and caused those to be slightly overrated. But I've done enough tests that I'd hope that wasn't too big a part of the sample. But that might be a little of what's going on, is I put a bunch of cards that had a 3 sticking out in the tests. Maybe. Maybe it's overrating those. I'm not sure. It's possible A953s are a lot better than we think. Now, there really aren't many A953 wheels. I did a quick skim and Delito was the only one I saw. There are probably others, but Braska is an A953 spear, and I couldn't think of any others off the top of my head. There's like a 5A93 in one of the newer decks. I don't remember what its name is. Yeah. It really likes rares, especially on second turn, and this underrates them. Like, Adia came 6th and is probably underrated because it's assuming on first turn you're keeping this card in hand. It says Adia is great on second turn and okay on first turn, but actually, if you're using it, it's probably your starter on first turn, and it's probably really good, and this isn't including value as starter. So Adia is probably even better than this rates it, and this rates it really, really high. It loves A963s for some reason, not entirely sure why. It likes A973s. It thinks they're a good bit better than A972s and A971s. Shout out to Turds Win and Triad Wars 16 using them. Really likes A955s. Those consistently have scored very well, both on first turn and second turn. Consistent, very good performer, which is why you didn't see it in the list. I don't think you saw it. If you did, I don't remember. Maybe you didn't, I'm just wrong now. But I think it scores very well first or second turn, not one of those cards that's value is changing much depending on turn. Just a very steady, good performer. And as I said, A9s tend to do well with opposites, so Fafnir Zidane is probably a really good basis to start building a hand from. In top two spots, we have Larsa and Hildebrand, two cards that do completely unique things, and they are just extremely powerful things. Yojimbo was ahead of his time, identifying that Larsa is an absolute beast. He is correct. These two cards are incredible, and currently the top two ranked in my stuff. As I was doing earlier iterations, they were not always top two, but as I've added more into the sample, they keep rising in value compared to the field. And that's all I got. So, if anyone has any thoughts on like some of these rankings, where they think they're right, where they think they're wrong, but most importantly, where you think they might be pointing out value that people aren't getting, I think that's probably the most interesting thing. Is where can we become better players? I think the fact that there are a lot of surprises here is, or at least to me, surprises, is really interesting and maybe could lead us into more varied directions. I'm excited to try doing this on other levels, see if it says anything interesting there, and just in general to further explore level 10 and build up my sample. This takes a while to run, uh, and so I don't know how soon I'll be adding more to this. But I'd like to keep exploring this because I think the cards having different value on first and second turn is really interesting. If they're why you would prefer certain cards as spears or as wheels. And also like stuff like if you were building a hand entirely to be good on second turn, or a hand entirely to be good on first turn. What are the differences there? And for a long time the difference has kind of been, are you building around a starter or are you building with plans to be able to react to starters? But maybe there's really more granular stuff of I want this specific type of card, I don't want that other type of card, I want to make sure I have this but not that. I think there's a lot of ground to explore, and I think it's really interesting. And yeah, I think this is probably a video for very few people. But if you are that person, I hope you found this exploration as interesting as I do.